whenever I talk about any of these movements or I put any of these movements up, people are still saying, and people are still wondering, that can't be safe for your knees.
I've had some mobility issues over the years, from years of powerlifting and I guess maybe just not paying attention to some of the things that you're talking about. And I tried to keep things in what I would consider to be full range of motion, but I've seen on some of your videos, you're trying to intentionally take things to an extreme. And when I was learning how to lift and stuff, people would consider that an extreme. They would say, don't move in those range of motions. So I was always kind of shy to move into some of those range of motions, doing something like dumbbell flies or movements like that. You would keep them a little tighter so that you wouldn't tweak anything. And then again, we kind of go back to the same principle. You can use more weight, you could use more weight. Maybe you can feel the muscles differently, or maybe you can argue better. And so you stay in this kind of shorter range of motion. What are some things that you've learned by really trying to have people kind of open up, even with weight, on some of these movements, like the ATG lunge or some of the other movements that you're employing?
Yeah, I'd love to hear how it's been for you guys. What do you notice instinctively in your bodies as you've been testing this stuff out? Is it a bad sensation, or is there something inherently this is rewarding?
I think an interesting thing is, for me, I don't move into deep ranges uncomfortably. It used to be that if I had too deep knee flexion or elbow flexion, or my shoulder was in a weird position in jiu-jitsu, I wouldn't want to get that deep into those positions, but I can comfortably move into deep positions without wincing or without feeling any type of discomfort, and move in and out of them with strength. It's I'm not passively getting into a really deep squat. I'm able to get there actively and move out of it actively. And as far as that transferring to athletics, as far as jiu-jitsu, that's extremely important, because being twisted around like a pretzel all the fucking time, and you need to be able to move well in that way. So it makes a very big difference for me.
For me, I'm just tight, so certain things are just, I don't have the same access to, maybe all the movement that somebody else might have. Kind of tight hips, tight shoulders. I can move pretty good on some stuff. And I can still lift pretty well and things of that nature, but especially through my upper body and my thoracic spine, that area is really it's just sort of stuck, but I spent 10 years trying to make it stuck so that it was real rigid, so it didn't move when I would do a squat.
Yeah. There's some cost, right? There's some price to pay for becoming world class in powerlifting, and that's a cool endeavor. And if you want to do that, full respect. Not everybody, needs to or wants to go down that path. And I think it's interesting to consider whether you actually need to take it as far, with specializing in what your body can and can't do. If you see Steffi Cohen, she can do the sissy squats really well, where probably a lot of world-class males maybe don't have that same comfort. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's going to be interesting to see how this stuff does impact that, because I know one of the guys Ben worked with got his first 1,000-pound squat, for example, when after he was doing some split squats and then he didn't have pain in his knee. So it's not like everyone's going to squat 1,000 pounds when they do split squats. I'm definitely not, that's not the message. But if you can have less pain and you have less inhibition to the muscle, then it kind of makes sense that you're going to be stronger. So those feedback loops are really important, and people are working really hard to build strength on top of dysfunction where there is inhibition, because it hurts and everything hurts all the time. And so you have to smash out, you have to go really hard with stimulants or whatever you're doing to get yourself going, where if there was no pain, you would just have better firing of the muscles because you don't have those inhibition loops. So it's an interesting thing of, how much can we regain without losing that specialist ability? I think is an interesting question that, you guys are going to solve, powerlifters are going to solve that, in that, where that all fits together. You do see some guys who have the big archery in powerlifting, though, who do have, super mobile thoracic spine, especially in the female side. Mm-hmm. So there's a possibility of, still having a super big bench with that stiffness in the upper back. But I think we need I guess what I'm trying to do is encourage looking at things from a fresh perspective and encouraging new language around some of this. So if we look at it from this perspective of, we don't care how your muscle reacts to this, we care about how your joint reacts to this. So it's not how much weight you can lift, it's how your joint is going to adapt to this movement, or at least be looking at both at the same time. And then that gives us the opportunity to say, okay, yeah, well, strength-wise, Mark can handle, 20 kilo flies. Like he's crazy strong, he's keeping his elbows in, he can, if he goes whatever, he's handling these big weights. But if we decide to take it into the full range of motion, 2 kilos is appropriate for now, because while the muscle could handle it, the joint is going to flare up and you're going to get issues with the rotator cuff, issues with the surface of the joint. And this is also like a key concept to consider with the knees over toes, is like maybe the muscle can handle it, like maybe you're strong enough to do it, but that doesn't give you the right to do it, especially to a maximal weight. Because if your joint is not adapting to it, or if your joint is like getting flared up by it, it doesn't matter that you can actually complete the movement muscle-wise, you don't have the readiness to do it. And so you're going to get some pain in the joint. You're going to get some, some swelling in there. You're going to stretch even the ACL. I think people are putting too much pressure sometimes on the ACL because they want to do these heavy step-ups and whatnot. And the muscle can handle it because they're super strong. But how many times has that ACL actually been loaded into this movement? You're basically repeating the mechanism of snapping the ACL under load. So you're just doing it in a slow, controlled way with weight, so you can control that and get adaptation. And eventually, maybe you end up being able to do what Ben can do, which is, a lot of people's vision is to get to that point. But we need to look at it from those two perspectives, I think. And if we look at it in that way, then we don't have any bad exercises anymore. We just have exercises where, okay, the joint's not ready for that. And so I can't, even though the muscle can handle it, I'm going to tear the joints to shreds versus the alternative,
We've all heard that to get optimal sleep, you should cool your room down to 68 to 69 degrees. But that's not all you need to do. And that's why we've partnered with 8 Sleep mattresses. Now they have the Pod Pro and the Pod Pro Cover. And the amazing technology of this mattress allows you to cool the mattress down to 55 degrees or to have it as warm as 110 degrees. But the great thing is that the temperature changes through the night based off your actual body temperature to make sure that you get the most restful sleep possible. You fall asleep 32% faster and you move around 40% less when you're actually asleep. It's amazing. And Andrew, how can people get it?
Yeah, this is amazing technology that actually changes its temperature based off of your sleep cycle. There's no other technology like it anywhere else. To take advantage of this, head over to 8sleep.com/power project. That's EIGHT sleep.com/power project. And you guys will receive $150 off this amazing technology. Links to them down in the description below. Let's get back to this video.
I'm really happy that you talked about that because, when I started doing this stuff, I had to start from the freaking shittiest regressions. Like I was kind of pissed at myself because when I was doing some step ups, I wasn't stepping up or down on anything. I was just going on the floor and starting there because my knees couldn't handle it. But it progressed slowly, and that's why my knees were able to get to where they are now. But whenever I talk about any of these movements or I put any of these movements up, people are still saying, and people are still wondering, that can't be safe for your knees, or that can't be safe for your elbows, or moving through those ranges of motion. That's going to cause a lot of problems, right? Can you talk to us about why a lot of these movements that are into these deep ranges of motion, why they're actually beneficial over time? Because, and we can talk more about this too, when we had Joel Seedman on, I don't know if you saw any of that episode, and I want to kind of preface this and say, I think Joel Seedman is doing a lot of things that's pretty cool and pretty beneficial for his athletes, because maybe for those athletes, going into those ranges isn't the best thing for them at that point in time. So limiting that range of motion could be beneficial. Okay. So I want to preface that, but he even mentioned over time, working in these deep ranges might actually bite you in the ass. That's what he said. Right. And we had a back and forth on that, but I want to get an understanding. Why is this actually better for you in the long run?
Yeah, I'm so happy that conversation is being had. I'm not here to fight against anyone else's perspective or the way they train. I think there is a lot of intelligent stuff in what Joel's doing, and obviously athletes don't go to people who they're not getting results from. Like they go for a little while because of the hype or because of whatever, but they're not going to keep going back. And he's been doing it for long enough that there is something there that works. Now, it's kind of the opposite of what I do and what I talk about and what I used with professional athletes that I've worked with, but that doesn't make it wrong. And I love the way, you're describing that of like, there are components of this that could be very, that are very beneficial. Like I'm a huge fan of partial movements. Like I think that, Louis Simmons, taking that to the extreme in powerlifting, like building on the old time knowledge and doing it with bands and chains is just, a next level genius. And it's had such a huge flow on effect especially to athletes. Like I can see the argument against that stuff for powerlifting because of specificity, but for athletes, it's phenomenal because it's about physics, it's about force, it's about tension. And it just makes so much sense to come at it from the angle of, accommodating resistance. And so partial repetitions are part of that same conversation. You can't have accommodating resistance being really smart and partial repetitions being super dumb. And there's a lot of partials in ATG, especially on the knee side. So, yeah, I mean, the full range stuff, it doesn't actually necessarily it doesn't even work like strength training. Like it doesn't have to be considered like strength training. You don't have to do it for the muscle. You can do it for the joint. And if you do it through that lens, then you don't have to max it out. It doesn't have to be like, you're bursting through your left eye with the spleen coming through the left eye, as Charles Poliquin used to talk about for strength training. Like it's not that. And I think if we can separate it, that's why I think the language is really important of like, is this a joint dominant exercise for you? Or is this like short range, long range, extreme long range? Like this vocabulary probably doesn't mean anything to half your listeners, but just that concept of, okay, like is the joint the limiting factor here? Like it's fairly intuitive to work out. Okay, yeah, I think the joint is the limiting factor in my step ups or in my flies. And so let's work from the joint perspective. And I think most coaches don't have that terminology. I definitely didn't have it through most of my coaching career. Like a lot of the things that I was doing with pro rugby teams, I would look at them differently, now. And that's a good thing. Like if you can't tell yourself 5 years ago that you got all this stuff wrong, then you wasted 5 years, right? So the extreme long range stuff over the long run, it makes you more childlike. It makes you more resilient. If you look at weightlifters, if you look at, gymnasts, there are a lot of examples like ballerinas. And I think there's a lot to be learned from ballet.
I got to stop you there for a second because weightlifters and gymnastics people are pretty ruined. They can't even do their sport for very long. Like Olympic lifting is a great example. People are in and out of that sport pretty quick.
That's a good point. And it definitely can shred you depending on how you do it. You will also see some of those guys who are in their 70s, 60s, 70s, and they're still able to jump, so the devil's in the details. If you train 6 days a week and you're not on a great diet and you're on a bunch of anabolics and you have to get to the Olympics or you don't get to eat, then that's a whole different, circumstance compared to someone who's using those movements in a different way. I think the research on the knee health of weightlifters is generally that they're getting positive adaptations in terms of like thick cartilage and in healthy knees. I love that podcast. I don't know if you guys ever caught the Jersey, someone who was on the Tim Ferriss podcast, and he was talking about taking a guy when he was 60, and he was at 60 he was like messed up, broken, and by 70 he had like a good snatch.
Wow.
And he was, so if you take 10 years and just focus on movement quality, that guy at 70, if you can snatch at 70, regardless of the weight, like you're doing pretty well. And I think that's, again, just like how you use the tool makes a big difference. So yeah, at the top level with weightlifting and gymnastics, you're right. Like it's gonna shred some people. But I think
having the ability to do those things is a wonderful thing. I think you hit the nail on the head by saying movement quality, and I think that may be something that might be compromised when somebody's maybe pushing to levels that their body's not really quite used to, and maybe that's why we see it. We see it with powerlifters, CrossFitters. We see it in all aspects of athletics. Whenever somebody's pushing the envelope and they're pushing maybe a little above and beyond what their body can really handle, they're going to fall apart. But if they start to gain access to what you're talking about, they start to gain access to being able to have better quality movements, who knows how long they could do it. Maybe that person can end up being like a Tom Brady, playing in the NFL for 22 years and still cranking.
Yeah. And that's also one of the things that Joel was mentioning. He was talking about how like, oh, you see what some of these athletes do over time and they're going to end up messing up their knees. But the big thing that we were talking about, it's like the dosage of this stuff. If you can take some concepts of what they're doing in weightlifting and gymnastics and add that in a reasonable way into somebody's program, they're not doing this every single day, but they're doing some of these movements at not a crazy high percentage in terms of intensity every fucking day. This can be something that actually helps them be more resilient over time. But if you're a weightlifter and you're doing those movements at max intensity or close to max intensity year after year after year, that will degrade you. Just like like a lot of pro athletes, even fucking basketball players, they end up being beat up. In basketball, if you're playing basketball twice a week, you'll be fine.
All right.
Yeah. Even looking at it through the lens of, what did they do with soldiers? Like soldiers is a high stakes game. How do you prepare armies? And if you look back at the research, especially the guys who've broken down even the ancient Greek stuff that's been translated, there was a guy in ATG for Coaches actually gave a lecture on it a couple of days ago, breaking down that history. He's a historian. He's written a couple of books. It's just phenomenal to hear his perspective. And he was basically saying all the ATG stuff was there. We think it goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks. They were doing it with the soldiers, so these guys, it was the system, Henry someone was the system, and Henry Lind or something like this is a Swedish guy. And it actually became the foundation for the German and British soldiers. And they were using these deep knee bend positions. And if you look back at the old strength stuff, like you'll see the deep knee bend in there everywhere. If you look at George Hackenschmidt, it's all there. It's quite a new phenomenon to say, we're going to take that out. We're not going to go into the full squat position. I mean, the full squat is literally, what you do when you don't have chairs. Like you go in and out of that position all day long. Like if you've traveled the world, you see that people will sit in that position and smoke cigarettes or play cards, and they'll be there for half an hour. They'll have dinner in that position. Like it's not negotiable because there's no chair. I heard a story about in Africa, soldiers over in Africa, and there were, these big, strong guys, and they were working together with the native soldiers. And the only way that they were, when they would stop, the guys who were from there would get down in deep squat and rest up. And the guys, the foreign soldiers weren't able to sit in the squat position, so they had to sit on the floor. The only problem was there were fire ants there. So they had to try and find weird places to rest themselves or just stand there with their, all day kind of thing. So obviously that position is like a very human position. It's just a question of how much load, we're meant to handle in that position. Even I spent some time in the hills of Mexico, and the old guys would carry their wood up the hills, right? And so they would have the wood on their back, and they would get out of a very deep squat position, and then they would carry that thing up the hill. I was in the mountains or down the hill, and the kids would sometimes have that as well. So it's knees over toes all day there. There's no choice about whether you're able to deep squat or whether you're able to get your knees over toes in time. And I think this is actually a key to rehabilitating people. And, I watch what the Chinese weightlifting guys are doing. I have some friends that have worked over there with the physios and whatnot. I don't think they actually have the understanding that you guys have now of short range work and sled work and how to bring a joint back to health and look after them. I've seen some of the work that they do to prepare themselves so that they don't get injured. And I do really think there's been something that has been lost there that can help a lot. So the guys who've got bench, pain in the shoulders, bench pressing, oftentimes I think the biceps is really tight and short, and that plays a massive part in shoulder dysfunction. And we're rolling and we're getting ART, we're doing all these different things. I actually saw you getting ART off Charles Poliquin, Mr. Bell. That was, it was good stuff.